Well, it's been an over 2-month-long wait, but I'm finally back. Life has finally slowed down just enough where I can slot in time to get one of these done. So without further ado, it's time for another episode of What Is? And this time we're going to be looking at the NWOBHM, or New Wave of British Heavy Metal. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to shorten it to the NWOBHM, simply because NWOBHM is just too many syllables to say. Okay, so the NWOBHM is an often overlooked period in metal's history, usually as something of a footnote when talking about the early histories of Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, or even perhaps with Motorhead and Judas Priest. Before I jump into this topic, I'll be covering a number of points from Ian Christ's The Sound of the Beast, and possibly inadvertently mentioning things that he talks about, or stating things in the way that he states them without even realizing it. I've read his book several times in the past, so if I'm not outright quoting him and forget to give him credit, the plagiarism is entirely accidental, and I highly recommend checking his book out. The BNR Metal pages were also a great resource for this topic, and I'm no doubt drawing on influence of the definitive New Wave of British Heavy Metal website from memory, which sadly no longer exists, NWOBHM.com. It was a great resource with band bios as well as rare promo posters for shows, information about demos and EPs, and interviews with the bands themselves. It will be missed. Okay, so the New Wave of British Heavy Metal is a period of heavy metal music that ran from about 1979 to 1984 and was based in the UK. The term was supposedly first coined in 1979 by Sounds writer and Kerrang! Magazine creator Jeff Barton, who noted a new style of metal bands playing live at the time. Most of the bands associated with the movement would only go on to be marginally successful, while other bands only lasted long enough to release a one-off EP, demo, or LP. Yet its influence on heavy metal at the time cannot be understated. Metallica, Slayer, Armored Saint, Anthrax, Rat, and countless other bands took their influence from the British scene of the early 1980s. European bands also took great influence from their British counterparts, directly influencing the likes of 220 Volt, Nightmare, Sortilege, and countless others. I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit too quickly, so let's backtrack further into heavy metal's history to set the stage for what would become the NWOBHM. What eventually became known as heavy metal began in the late 1960s with the Big Three: Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and Led Zeppelin. Yes, there were many more metal bands at the time, and metal's history begins earlier than that with acid rock and hard rock, but that's another video for another time. So for now, let's just stick with the Big Three as our jumping off point. The music of the Big Three was obviously important for the new wave of British heavy metal bands and would form the basis of their style. But what really makes the NWOBHM its own unique movement was what was going on behind the scenes. And that X factor that separated the early metal bands from the NWOBHM bands was punk. Yes, that punk. By the mid-1970s, the teens and young adults who had grown up on hard rock were growing stale of its excesses at the time. Extended solos, pretentious songs, millionaire celebrities, and lyrics that spoke about fantasy and rocking did little to address these kids' real-life situations. Punk, on the other hand, was a reaction to all of this. Its fans and bands wore safety pins as jewelry, had outrageous hair dye, which was spiked or partially shaved off. Punk was, in the words of Ian Christ, visual violence. It presented a tough and pissed-off attitude, and its music and iconography was a reaction to mainstream culture, much like the hippie countercultural movement that had preceded it. Punk's message was one of anger and contempt for the status quo, and most importantly, anyone could be a part of it. This is what made punk particularly unique. You didn't need to be a learned musician or have a record contract to form a band. Anyone could pick up an instrument, learn a few chords, and make an album. Punk's albums were released on independent labels, often with crude or photocopied artwork, and were promoted in similarly crude magazines, flyers, and by word of mouth. Punk first gained its initial foothold in New York City with the Ramones' self-titled album's release in 1976. It would quickly gain a significant following in London, England shortly thereafter. In England, unemployment at the time was high and the cost of living was skyrocketing. The world's economy was entering a state known as stagflation, and much like today, the economic outlook was bleak for young people. Those living in the post-war UK had finally found music that addressed their immediate living conditions and their angsty teen spirit. The Ramones would go on to influence nearly every punk band that would follow them, from the Sex Pistols to Black Flag. Punk's ultimate implosion would come about for many reasons, but one reason is that punk's icons like the Ramones and Sex Pistols suddenly became millionaires. Bands who had once sang about the terrors of major labels, the Sex Pistols song EMI comes to mind, were suddenly sitting pretty with major label contracts and hundreds of thousands of album sales. It's hard to be railing against society and the rich and powerful when you come into money of your own. Another problem it faced was musical. Punk was limited in terms of what it could do. Many punk bands, but certainly far from all, weren't all that musically competent, and they quickly ran out of ideas, or found partying, drugs, and girls too tempting to continue writing music. And as with all genres, fans and bands alike begin to outgrow the material or put music on the back burner as life begins to take over, and the new wave of British heavy metal would be no different in that regard. In the mid-1970s, despite the popularity of disco, the relative popularity of punk, and the emerging scene of new wave, heavy metal remained largely underground in the late 1970s, save largely, of course, for Eddie Van Halen's influence, which reminded the critics that hard rock was still alive and well and had hungry audiences waiting in the aisles. By the late 1970s, metal's revival was coming fast. Headbangers in England were ready to use what they had learned from the punk movement to their advantage. Many of the up-and-coming youth had grown up on the early material of Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, as well as glam rock and punk, and they were ready to form heavy bands of their own. The new metal bands emerging in England began to record demos, singles, EPs, and full-length albums. Although the majors swept up only a handful of these bands, a number of independent labels sprung up in England ready to release these albums, the most famous of which was Neat Records, who would release albums by Raven, Venom, Fist, Tigers of Pantang, Blitzkrieg, Jaguar, and many others. Punk's influence also showed up in the newfound aggression of the NWOBHM bands. Songs were shorter, heavier, and punchier. Many in the NWOBHM scene at the time identified Motorhead as a major influence, who themselves played loud hard rock set to the speed and grit of punk music. Another important influence was that of dual harmony guitar work found in the early works of Wishbone Ash, Thin Lizzy, and the Scorpions. Iron Maiden would later take dual harmony guitar work to stunning new levels, which remains a staple in heavy metal to this very day. Judas Priest formed another essential ingredient in the forerunning of the NWOBHM scene. Beginning from their blues roots in the late 1960s, they eventually transformed into a hard rock act with the additions of Rob Halford and Glenn Tipton. When bands were afraid to be known as heavy metal, Priest wore the name as a badge of honor, along with iconic heavy anthems and impressive musicianship to boot. Priest also greatly influenced metal fashion. Adopted from the gay S&M scene in England, Rob Halford wore leather bondage gear, which would become Priest's visual trademark. This attire, unbeknownst to straight metalheads, became the stage outfits for countless metal bands that would follow. All of this became the rallying cries for the NWOBHM bands, as this was the first movement that fully adopted the heavy metal banner at a conscious level. In the early 1970s, Sabbath, Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and many others may have been branded heavy metal by some, but their love of the blues shone through in their music, and they still considered themselves to be rock artists at heart. 1970s hard rock bands were also still wearing bell-bottoms and open flowery shirts. The NWOBHM bands opted to follow in Priest's footsteps when it came to their attire. Bands wore leather and spikes, and fans began wearing denim and leather jackets covered in the logos of their favorite band's patches. This look was largely adopted from the rocker subculture in England in the 1960s and 70s, which did battle, quite literally, against the mods, who were sort of a mixture between today's hipsters and preps. The mods were the rich kids, who dressed in fashionable clothing. The rockers, on the other hand, wore biker attire and was largely a continuation of the fashion of the biker gangs of the 1950s. Metalheads in England and Europe at the time had lived through, to quote Ian Christ, terrorists, economic downturns, and the presence of NATO or Eastern Bloc troops during the Cold War. In short, their attire was just a fashionable extension of the toughness these people lived in their daily lives. But this newfound fashion statement among metalheads extended far beyond the concert hall. It quickly became a way for metal fans to identify each other in public. At a university, the mall, or a pub, spotting someone across the way with a Saxon shirt or leather jacket with a Motorhead patch meant an instant connection between fans. It certainly wasn't like today, where you just have to search the internet to find an online community to discuss your love of metal. Back in the day, your look was the only thing on the surface that let others know about your love of metal. The NWOBHM movement provided metal with an excellent foundation upon which it would prosper and grow as a genre. By the mid-1980s, heavy metal began to dominate the mainstream. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, and Accept all had hits by the time 1984 rolled around. Likewise, more radio-friendly metal bands such as Rat, Motley Crue, and Quiet Riot began to have global success. Many of the new wave of British heavy metal bands who had been around for several years, amidst little success, began to feel the pressure to change their sound to something more radio-friendly and away from the traditional metal sounds of early Priest and Iron Maiden. Thus, the style of NWOBHM bands would ultimately be replaced in time, just as every musical movement grows and changes. Further still, a number of bands opted to play a more extreme version of metal, such as the thrash metal of Pariah, who would follow in the footsteps of bands like Anthrax, Slayer, and Metallica, whom the NWOBHM had originally influenced. Other NWOBHM bands, however, continued marching on with their traditional metal sound, such as the case of Saxon and Praying Mantis. And of course, many of the other bands would only last for a few years in the NWOBHM movement, just as the punks had previously, and decide to call it quits as life's priorities took over in adulthood. Okay, so now that we've got some history about the genre and its culture, what did it actually sound like? Well, after I play you a couple samples here, if you're still looking to hear more new wave of British heavy metal bands, the best starting place would be to track down a copy of Metal for Mothers 1 and 2 or the Lars Ulrich compilation of NWOBHM bands. Each offer a wide smattering of artists, and Metal for Mothers served as my own introduction into this period of music. So in no real particular order, and with dozens of personal favorites missing, here's a list of 15 of some of my favorite NWOBHM songs. In this list, there are no duplicate artists, nor will there be Def Leppard, Diamond Head, or Maiden, because really, what's the point? If you've been a metalhead long enough, you'll know these bands. Okay, so here we go with number 15.
Capture City, city in the sky. Capture City. Strutting and I'm posing for you. And I'm a flyer. Set me free. I'm prisoner. Let me out. Can I make you an offer? You carry on.
Strangers in the night, both on separate flights.
As you can hear, by today's standards, a lot of NWOBHM music would sit comfortably within the confines of what's now known as classic rock. So in that respect, it may be hard to tell just what about its influence was so important for thrash, death, and power metal, which would follow. As with all influences, the works of others are adopted, which then keep the elements they like and enhance other elements to improve upon it. The clothing, the DIY ethic, the push for faster and more aggressive songs, and the bands adopting the title of heavy metal as a badge of honor would all prove to be rallying cries throughout the evolution of heavy metal.